For decades, buying a game came with a set of expectations. Once you paid for it, you decided what happened next. You could keep it, lend it to a friend, sell it, build a collection, or simply come back years later. That wasn't just how games were sold, it was what players expected ownership to mean. But recently, PlayStation announced that it will stop producing physical discs for new releases starting in 2028. At first, that sounds like another story about physical versus digital games. I don't think it's the whole story. I think it's a story about how the meaning of ownership has been quietly changing for years. For most of gaming's history, ownership wasn't something players really thought about, not because it wasn't important, but because it felt obvious. You walked into a store, you picked up the game, you paid for it, and from that moment on, what happened next was largely up to you. You could play it immediately, leave it on the shelf for years, lend it to a friend, sell it when you were done, trade it in for your next game, or build an entire collection around it. None of those things felt unusual. They were simply part of buying a game. Most players never stopped to question what ownership actually meant, because for decades, everyone seemed to share roughly the same understanding. Buying a game came with set up expectations, not because publishers explicitly promised them, but because every physical purchase reinforced the same experience. The game was yours to keep, yours to lend, resell, to revisit whenever you wanted. Ownership wasn't something players debated. It was simply something that they experienced. And that's why I don't think PlayStation's recent announcement is really about discs, because the disc was never the important part. It was simply the thing that made those expectations possible. Looking back, I don't think the meaning of ownership changed because of one decision. I think it changed because gaming itself slowly changed. Physical copies gradually became digital libraries, store shelves became online storefronts, collections became accounts, and buying a game no longer meant taking something home. It increasingly meant adding it to a platform. That wasn't necessarily a bad thing. In many ways, it made gaming better. It made it more convenient. Games became instantly available. Preloads meant you could start playing the moment a release went live. Updates arrived automatically. Cloud saves made it easier to move between devices. Entire libraries became available wherever you logged in. For millions of players, digital gaming simply became more convenient, and that's exactly why the shift happened so naturally. Very few people stopped to think about what had actually changed, because almost everything about the experience felt like an improvement. But convenience quietly changed something else. It changed the relationship between players and the games they bought. The game was no longer just something sitting on a shelf in your home. It had become part of a much larger digital ecosystem, an ecosystem built around accounts, platforms, licenses, and ongoing access. None of those ideas felt particularly important at first because the experience still felt familiar. You clicked buy, you downloaded the game, and started playing. For most players, it still felt like ownership, but beneath the familiar experience, the meaning of ownership had already begun to evolve, and I don't think most of us really noticed it happening. Most players never really noticed that shift until something happened that challenged the expectations they had for years. For a long time, digital ownership felt almost identical to physical ownership. You clicked buy, you download the game, and everything worked exactly as you expected. That's why so few people questioned it. Difference only became visible when players started to do something they'd always assumed would be possible and suddenly discovered that it wasn't. Then players started encountering situations they hadn't really thought about before. A purchased movie disappeared because a licensing agreement expired. An online game became inaccessible after its servers shut down. A digital title could no longer be purchased at all. Each situation was different, but they all raised the same question. What exactly does it mean to own something that's tied to a digital platform? PlayStation's recent decision to move away from physical game discs after 2028 raises that question once again. Not because digital games are inherently worse, but because another part of the traditional ownership experience quietly begins to disappear. With physical games, ownership extended beyond simply playing them. You could lend a game to a friend, sell it when you were finished, buy it secondhand for a lower price, or simply choose between different retailers competing for your purchase. Buying a physical game wasn't just about owning the game itself. It also meant participating in a competitive marketplace where players had real choices. As gaming becomes increasingly digital, one of those choices become far more limited, not because of one controversial decision, but because digital distribution works differently. The platform increasingly becomes a place where access, pricing, and availability are managed. That doesn't automatically make the experience worse. Digital gaming has made buying, downloading, and updating games easier than ever before, but it does change what ownership looks like. The conversation isn't really about discs, it's about the expectations that quietly disappeared with them. It's easy to look at this conversation and assume it's simply about choosing between physical and digital games. I don't think it is. I don't think that's the whole story, because digital gaming solved problems that physical media never could. You no longer have to leave your house to buy a new release. Games can preload before launch. Updates happen automatically. Entire libraries follow you wherever you sign in. For millions of players, that's simply a better experience. And that's exactly why the industry has moved in this direction. Technology didn't make gaming worse. In many ways, it made it significantly better. But every technological shift changes more than the problem it set out to solve. It also changes the expectations surrounding it. The convenience of digital gaming didn't just change how we buy games. It gradually changed what buying a game actually means. With a physical copy, many decisions remained with the player. You decided whether to keep it, lend it to a friend, sell it years later, or simply place it back on the shelf until you wanted to play again. In a digital ecosystem, many of those decisions increasingly depend on the platform itself. Not because companies are necessarily trying to take something away from players, but because digital distribution works differently. Access, licensing, pricing, availability, they are no longer determined solely by the company you purchased. They're increasingly shaped by the ecosystem surrounding it. And I think that's the real trade-off we rarely talk about. We usually frame this as a debate between physical and digital games, but I don't think that's what this really is about. It's about how technology quietly changes the relationship between players and the things they buy. The discs were never the real story, it was simply the clearest symbol of what ownership used to feel like. So, what does it actually mean to own a game anymore? I don't think there's a simple answer to that question, because the industry hasn't changed overnight, and neither have the expectations players bring with them. For decades, buying a game came with a shared understanding of what ownership looked like, not because anyone formally defined it, but because the experience was remarkably consistent. You bought a game, and what happened next was largely your decision. Today's gaming landscape looks very different, not necessarily worse, and not necessarily better, just different. Digital platforms have made games more accessible than ever before. They've removed countless barriers that physical media could never solve, and they've also introduced a different relationship between players, platforms, and the games they purchase. And I don't think that's what PlayStation's announcement really highlights. Not the end of discs, but the end of an assumption that many players never realized they were making. For years, ownership wasn't something most people questioned. Now it is. Not because the industry suddenly changed direction, but because years of gradual change have finally become impossible to ignore. Maybe that's the real conversation we should be having. Not whether physical games are better than digital ones, but whether our understanding of ownership has quietly evolved without us fully noticing. Because technology doesn't just change the products we buy, it also changes what buying those products actually means. And maybe PlayStation's decision isn't the beginning of that story. It's simply the moment many of us finally stopped to ask what ownership means in the first place.